Hello everyone, my guest of today is Laura from wullerstorff. Laura has been a practicing physiotherapist for probably over 20 years by now. Yeah, she's originally from the US and I got to know her through her husband Bernard. We used to play squash together. Hopefully in the future we can play again. So after meeting her husband, she followed him to Belgium and opened our physiotherapy practice in Brussels, somewhere in 2009. A couple of years later, the whole family, as well as the clinic, moved to Hoeilaart, which is not too far from my studio here. But in the meantime, they opened another clinic in Brussels, and mainly ran by her colleagues, John and Nicolas. And besides that, she owns and operates her own physiotherapy consulting business, which allows her to teach manual theory courses, mainly in the US and Europe. She's a teacher, but also a lifelong learner. Laura is now also a doctor in physical therapy with a successful study on the clinical detection of deep fracture in pars region of the lumbar spine. What that means in normal language, she will tell us. And she's specialized in deep dry needling. She's also, like myself, a certified post-method of running coach. She's a mom of 3, a swimming coach, and a keen runner herself. I can go on and on and on, but it's time to kick off the conversation. So Laura, how are you?
Good. Thanks, Ken, for having me join you today.
So if there's something that is not correct, then please correct me. Thank you for being here on your day off. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I appreciate it enormously to have you here. So I believe you went for a long run today.
Yes, this morning I had a little sleep in and then took my nimble toes shoes and off into the woods and ran across a couple friends out in the woods. But just to have some downtime from 3 kids at home is my sanity is to be able to run. So
is that nowadays the reason why you run? Because before you were doing races, and is this to get away and to relax? Or
yeah, so now my running is my decompression time to just go out, think, maybe listen to a podcast as I run. But I don't wear music. I don't take music with me, as you know, because most of the music is at the wrong tempo anyways. So if I have anything, it's my own brain or my own thoughts that I'm going through, or every once in a while when I need to listen to some work podcasts, I'll have them. But more just to go out and enjoy being out in the woods.
Yeah. How long are you away from then? Is that like an hour or half an hour? Or?
An hour and a half. Okay. Typically, I'll mix in my lunges and my squats out in the middle of the woods, just because, as you know, when you come back to the clinic or you come back home, it's no longer about you. It's all about being a mama and being a wife, and what can you do? They need this or they need that. So if I want a little bit of a workout in for my own, then I do it out in the middle of the woods.
Then you have to hide in the woods to do some lunges.
Yeah, find my hills so I can do walking lunges up the hill. Or
okay, we'll talk more about that later. Were you always a runner, or did you practice other sports before? You're also a swimming coach, so I assume you did a lot of swimming in your life.
Yes, growing up, we were active in multiple sports. I was a football player, swimming, dancer, a lot of the different sports. I never was I never had hand and eye coordination. Foot or running and swimming. Those were the things I liked. And then I got into specialized horseback training. So I was a horseback rider for many, many years, training my horse, and then I was training other people's horses. That was really nice. I did 3-day eventing and dressage. So I had to specialize. You know, when you're younger, you try everything. And then as you grow up, you start to say, this is what I really want to do. And around age of 4th grade, that's when I started to decide that I was going to be a horseback rider, and specialized all my time and my training into that. I would run just to keep fit on the side, but I'd stopped swimming, I stopped football, and just spent my time with the horses. And that kind of got me into my own career, because I was out running, you know, galloping down the fields with my friends, out in the pasture, out in the side field, and my horse fell in a hole and tripped and rolled over me, and then rolled over me again, and I was knocked unconscious, and a big lorry driver saw the accident and had to call the ambulance, and spent the weekend in the hospital. And then from that injury, both my horse and I had injuries that we had to recuperate from and recover. And that got me onto the world of physical therapy, and specifically manual therapy.
Okay, yeah, you skipped a few questions here that you summarized very nicely. So, but I believe your parents moved around a lot. So was that easy to combine with your horse riding passion when you always had to move house and move environment, or was that when you were somewhere fixed? Or?
When I first started, we were in the Philippines, and that's where I started. And at the base there, they just had horses that you could lease. So we were there for 2 years. And so I just leased a horse and got into it. Then when we went to Texas, down in Randolph, that's where we ended up buying a horse. And we spent several years down in Texas, about, I think it was 3 years, two and a half. Themselves moved to Hawaii, but I stayed behind. Riding was, like I said, I was doing it very competitively and showing my horse and showing for other people. So I stayed behind with some friends and lived with them and continued showing. And then I moved to Hawaii, and I left my horse with my friends. They would take care of it, but then on the breaks or in the summer, I'd spend my breaks in summer going back to the mainland and riding. And then when I was in Hawaii, I picked up riding other horses again. I'm taking lessons and leasing and mucking out stalls just so that I could ride. So I kept up my riding in Hawaii, but on my breaks, I was flying back to the mainland to compete with my horse.
Okay. And after the injury, were you forced to stop your career, or could you,
no,
you return?
No. I continued. I continued. I just had this chronic pain in my upper back, and trying to figure out why did I have this pain. And the vet, about a year after the accident, the veterinarian was there to look at my horse, who had some trouble after the injury, just knots and muscle tightnesses. And he pushed on my rib joint, and it really hurt. So then I said, okay, maybe I should start doing something about it. You know, right away after the injury, you think you're fine. I just had a head concussion, and I came back really fast. My horse, I had to stop competing. Wasn't able to compete in state championship. I was in the state championship that summer, but due to his injuries, I had to pull out of that state championship. So he had a little bit of a longer recovery just to get him back and sound again. And then, you know, with the human body, a lot of those injuries that you first have, they don't show up until 6 months, 8 months, 9 months down the road. But then that started my experiences of going to an orthopedic surgeon, going to a physical therapist, trying out a chiropractor, and saying, okay, this is not working. I'm going to go into the field of physical therapy and try to figure this out myself. So that's what I did.
If only all people were thinking like that. some just learn to cope with it. It's amazing how many people think that way. Exactly. So, okay. And so where did you go to school then? You were in Hawaii?
In Hawaii, I was my high school. So I graduated secondary school in a private school in Hawaii. It was basically a college prep school that we had there at Punahou, which was a very good school that got me. College was a breeze compared to what you had to try to do in the undergrad. You were always being there. Everything was being graded on a curve. So you, even when you were, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 in your last years, you were competing against your classmates. And so even, you have these extremely hard mathematical exams or science exams, and depending upon how everybody else studied, you might get one wrong and still get what they would like a 3.0 or a B, so the pressure was on. And, we had a lot of intense intellectual people at the university, at the school. So it helped me prepare. It helped me keep organized. Yeah. And more importantly, be able to manage your time and be able to pick up at the beginning of a semester and say, okay, look through the syllabi and say, okay, when are your exams for all your tests, and start putting them in your calendar and starting to be able to time management. How are you going to study for those exams? So they don't show up and have 6 exams on the same day and trying to study for them all at once. But that's where I did my secondary school. And then my horse, of course, was down in Texas. So I was going to go where my horse was. That's where my riding. So I went to the University of Texas in Austin, studied there. And then I decided that I wanted to be out of the South, and I wanted to be up Northwest, and kind of closer to family. And University of Washington had a very good medical school up there. So I applied to go into medical, to go up there at the University of Washington. But in the meantime, my parents were in South Korea. And so I went over at Christmas to spend Christmas with them. And then in the meantime, when I was there, I was speaking to my parents and our chaplain, and he said, "Oh, it's too bad that you're not staying. You could help us out with one of this Korean elementary schools that was in the area, about 30 minutes from the base." And so I went and actually helped out for 2 weeks. I was supposed to be an aide, but I've always loved teaching. And when I was there and they were trying to put lesson plans together, I started to chime in and say, well, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about maybe doing this? And gave them some different ideas. And they turned and said, hey, do you want to have your class for 2 weeks your own? You can take the 5th graders. And so I did. And that was really eye-opening. Because you have 5th graders that you're learning who are, Korean speaking, learning English, and you realize how people learn, that they don't just always learn from what you say, but your facial expressions, your hands expressions, how you ask a question. So I would have somebody come in from the US when I was teaching. They would read a book and they try to ask questions and there would be no response. I could ask the same question, but use my intonation a little bit differently or use my hand gesture. And then the kids would understand, oh, this is what they're asking. Mm-hmm. So I ended up writing the University of Washington and saying, thank you very much for my acceptance, but I would like to defer it. And I stayed in Korea for 6 months and taught 2nd, 3rd, and 5th grade English to Christian elementary kids, and traveled through China and spent time in China looking at the Great Wall and Shanghai and looking at life there before Beijing was changed over. And then from there, I went to the University of Washington and finished my first degree in speech pathology audiology with my prerequisites for my master's degree in physical therapy. And then from there, I went to Eastern Washington because they had a very, very good master's program for physical therapy. And that's where I ended up with my master's.
And in the meantime, were you working in a practice somewhere?
No. So in the US, you can't work until you finish your graduate level physical therapy. So I was doing volunteer work. I was working actually in a design bed linens design shop just to make money as a college student, but I wasn't working in my field. I wasn't being paid. So I finished my master's, and after you finish your master's, then you take your board exam, and then I got a job. But while I was in my master's, I got exposure to manual therapy. And so I started studying underneath NIOPT with some great clinicians, and spent basically, my father said, 7 years of your life just paying rent for your apartment, you know, not really living in my apartment. So I was working during the week in the clinic and spending every weekend studying and taking courses, both for myself as well as learning how to become an instructor, a fellowship instructor myself. And then I started my doctorate program. Not to say that you didn't need more things on your plate, but so I did my doctorate program through Andrews. It's a Doctor of Science in physical therapy. So it's different than an entry level. Most of the physical therapy schools now in America are entry level doctorate programs. The science is a postgraduate higher level doctorate with a specialty in clinical. So it's a little bit different than a PhD, because a PhD is more research based. And I wanted a doctorate that was very clinically based, because research is great and it's needed, but I'm more of a clinician, and I wanted to be having something that's applicable in the clinic.
Exactly. It's the difference is also a little bit, one is mostly research based, and the other one can influence the course of the future a little bit more.
Right.
I believe.
Yeah, exactly. And then you take what you do as a clinic and what you take your experience and your findings, and then you work with somebody who's a researcher, and you say, okay, we need to figure out, for example, we were talking to a colleague of mine, and to say that, okay, the psoas and the quadratus lumborum, they're actually one muscle. They're just on either side of the transverse processes, and there's deeper layers. And it was really interesting to talk to him, and his idea of, okay, this superficial quadratus lumborum, which is attached to the iliac crest and attaches to the 12th rib. Why would it do that? It doesn't attach to the lumbar spine, actually, not the superficial layer, like it says it does, but it actually doesn't. And what's the reason for that? And the connection, or what's on the front side of that 12th rib? What's the diaphragm? Okay, you're taking breathing classes right now. Okay, what's the importance of the diaphragm with low back pain? And how does the diaphragm affect neck pain? And how is the anatomy all connected?
It's very interesting. We'll also come back to that a little bit further. But first, like I said in the introduction, can you explain in your own words the study that you just finished? Become a doctor in
the pars interarticularis fractures.
Yeah. So what was it about?
So pars interarticularis are stress fractures in the lumbar spine, in a part of what we call the posterior element, which is called the pars interarticularis. It happens mostly in adolescents or younger children, typically in the adolescent years when they're growing. It comes from repetitive injury. It's not something that you fall and happen. You don't fracture typically the pars from just falling on your bum, but it's a repetitive extension and rotation, what they thought was. I have my differences. I don't think it's typically just extension and rotation, a loading issue, but if we look at the work from Nikolai Bobduck from Australia, that when you go from extreme extension and rotation to flexion and contralateral rotation, that you have a bending of the pars. And so you have this constant force of being put on the pars, as well as being pulled and traction on the pars. And it's basically, to simplify it, it's a shin splint, but in the back. So if, you know, if you're running and you start to get little shin splints in your shin, it's what happens in the back. And you get, at first you get bruising, you get swelling, you get irritation. And over time, with that continued stress, then you start to have small microfractures in the bone that start to develop.
Would you see that more in like young gymnasts, for example?
Gymnasts, football players, usually on their kicking leg, their dominant kicking leg, because again, they're going from severe extension to flexion, and then at that flexion point, they impact that ball with quite a lot of force, and that force can come up into the lumbar spine. You see cricket players, swimmers, so butterflyers, because they're going, again, everything that they're doing in that butterfly motion. Tennis players, volleyball players, you know, a lot of that motion. I look also at their holistic look. You know, what could be, some kids can tolerate it, some kids can't. So we see correlating factors like, have they suddenly grown in the last year? So it's not a slow growth, but it's sudden growth. We look at their diet. I've really been keen for several years on sugar intake. There's more and more coming out, but I was saying this a long time ago about you need to limit the sugar intake, and everything, especially in the US, it has a lot of added sugar to it.
Corn syrup.
Yeah. And so I influence the diet and also what they do. There's not a lot of cross training. Are they spending hours and hours in their sport, or are they developing their body and cross training? And that also gets into the weaknesses of the deeper segmental muscles. So a lot of people look at, okay, I need to work on my core. So they do a lot of planks, a lot of physio ball exercises. And we're working with top level athletes. You know, some of these gymnasts and football players are top level. And why are they having this breakdown in their core? It's because they're not weak. Globally, you look at them and you can see the definition of their muscles. But when we look at the segmental level, we find weakness and inhibition. We should call it more inhibition, and an incoordination of the muscles.
And is it less common in adults? Or is it?
Interarticular fractures are less common. Yes, the actual fracture itself, that type of stress injury is far less common. And a lot of times when you find it in adults, it happened during their youth. You have coinciding factors of like spinal bifida occulta, which is a deformation and that happens when you're born. You may not have the closure of the neural arch, but in adults we see the similar issues with the core from degenerative changes. So we have something called degradation and degeneration. Degeneration is actually normal changing, and degradation is abnormal changing. And when there has been trauma or repetitive stress to certain segments, we can see narrowing of the disc in the lumbar spine and the low back. And most doctors, and a lot of times people think, oh, that's normal. You know, as you get older, your discs thin. Well, that's actually not true. Our disc in the lumbar spine and the low back do not thin. What thins, what shrinks is the vertebral body height. And so you have actually the expansion of the disc into the vertebral height. And that's why you see on x-rays, if you see of a young person, the x-ray or the MRI, the vertebral bodies look pretty much of a square. But as they start to age, you start to see these bowing into it, and you'll see the expansion of the disc into that space. But when we look at somebody who's had trauma and we look at their imaging, we see a thinning of the disc, and the height of the disc is actually decreased. And when we see that, we right away know that that person has had trauma. At some point in their life, they've had inflammation in their life. And so if that's the case, that starts to have what we call hypermobility, very, very small. It's not radiographic. So a lot of your orthopedic doctors will think, oh, it's not radiographically unstable. Don't call it an instability, because to them, it's gross movement. This is fine movement control, but it's enough that makes the whole neurological system shut down. And they start to get inhibition. And when you start to get inhibition, you start to get pain and tendinitises and tendinoses and breakdown. And now somebody's coming in with a chronic tendinitis in the ankle from during running, or hamstring pain, tendinitis. We see that that's, yes, they have a local pathology, but where's the real culprit? So we like to look at, victims and culprits. And a lot of times as we age, we get more victims lower down in the chain, a knee injury, ankle injury, our hip, especially that's a lot of times in people, they come in with gluteus medius tendinitis. And you go, okay, that's the victim. That tissue broke down, and yes, you have inflammation, you have changes in it, but where is the fundamental breakdown? And we look more towards the spine. So it does happen in adults. The idea, the concept of loss of neuromuscular control and inhibition, but more from changes, articular changes that shouldn't have occurred, versus a pars interarticularis fracture.
Okay, very interesting, all of that. So I'm sure we can talk a long time about this. During your career, these 20 years now, do you see a change in injuries or discomforts? Like, for example, now we have this mobile phone posture a lot, which you didn't see 20 years ago. This is just an example. Do you, like people that come to your practice, do you see an evolution or a change in the most common discomfort, injuries, changes in the body? Or does it remain more or less the same?
In the, 20 years, I was, when I first started, I was working in Seattle. That's a very Microsoft-based city. So spine, low back and neck were a huge problem, just because the hours that people spent on computers there. So whether it was mobile phones or whether it was sitting on the computer, it's the sitting. It's that sitting, slouched, forward head posture.
And now with the lockdown everywhere, it's the same problem. Everybody that comes here, and 90%, there's like, move less, more pain. I don't come out of my kitchen chair, and yeah.
Yeah, and they during the lockdowns, they don't have the work environment. They don't have the proper chairs. They don't have the proper desk. They're sitting. And sometimes just the simplest things of saying, okay, take a towel and wedge it and stick it underneath your bum and keep your knees below your hips. So you're not putting pressure on your ischial tubes or your butt bones, but you're more of a tilted position and kind of on the back of your thighs to get that pressure off of that bum. Because the minute you rock back onto that pelvis, now you've changed the whole dynamics. Or we should do it like we do in pose, squat. We see, I think it's more of a problem of modernized societies. That's where we see a lot of problems coming into the fact of we sit in chairs. In Asia, when I lived in Asia, you go to nice restaurants, you go to the toilet, and it was still a squat toilet. There's a hole in the ground. I mean, they had nice things that you could pull, but you still squatted all the way down and to use the toilet. And now you look at kids in the high schools and secondary, and you ask somebody to squat, and how many of them no longer can squat and keep their heels on the ground? In some of these programs, you have people teaching to squat and putting wedges underneath their heels. Because they can't squat and keep their heels on the ground, they're making the modification of taking a shoe or taking a wedge and putting it underneath their heel. And as you know, and I know, that is a detriment to the Achilles tendon and to the rest of the chain, because now you're changing mechanics. And the best thing you can do is get somebody to be able to squat, as you say, 30 minutes a day with their heels on the flat on the ground for the health of their ankles, knees, and hips. And we see that more and more hip replacements and knee replacements are coming out of societies that have lost the ability to squat.
You
and the change occur in the pelvis and the low back. I mean, and you'll hear individuals say, well, I haven't been able to squat for years. And my reply is, show me a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old that cannot squat.
Yeah, exactly.
So some point in time they could squat, but they started to sit in a chair. And, you know, we have kids, you know, getting them to sit in a chair is not the easiest thing because it's not natural. It's not natural to sit on your bum for long hours. We should teach school in a squat position, you know, make sure that they don't fall over.
So what would your advice be if people cannot keep the heels on the ground? Would you use wedges for a certain amount of time, or would you rather have people hanging on to something while they squat so they don't fall backwards? Or
I for part of my individuals, I have them hold on to a radiator and every day work on getting those heels down and not compensating with the heels, with the wedges. If they can't squat, if they're doing weight training and they can't squat without raising their heels, then don't go so low. I mean, just why make a compensation when your body's not designed? Because you're going to be putting pressure on other areas that aren't really designed to have that force. So I say, just work on, do what you can physically, small bits, but frequently, and work on those deep squats. And tissue like that doesn't change overnight. So doing a 30-second stretch isn't enough. You need long, sustained stretch on that capsular tissue to make a permanent change. Yeah. So I think, okay, you know, like
there's no quick fix. We need consistency in everything we do.
Exactly. And, you know, holding that position for 5 minutes, working up, adding a minute, okay, work up to 10 minutes, work up. You know, how many times are they sitting on their bum answering emails on a phone? Instead of sitting answering the phone, squat and answer your phone. So I had one of my patients during a couple of years ago, like at midnight in Brussels, go up to waiting for the tram, took off his shoes and was squatting. And within a minute, there was police right there asking him if he was okay. So
yeah, I can imagine. Okay, good. So in the meantime, to come back to your injury, was it solved at the point when you were digging into physical therapy courses, and did you manage to get over the pain?
Yeah, actually, you know, when I was young, I had surgeons that wanted to do surgery on it. I had gone to a chiropractor who had manipulated my neck. I had people doing massage to my rib and my muscle. But during my residency, we have several residencies. I met one of my mentors, Steve Allen, and he is a very experienced manual therapist. And he took one look at it and he was like, oh, it's your second rib. It's not moving. And instead of doing there are manipulators that manipulate, but they can be very generalized manipulators. They just do what we call gapping techniques. And we teach very directional techniques. So the rib joint was stuck and not moving posterior laterally. It was stuck what we call anterior medially. It wouldn't come all the way out. So yes, he took a look at it, he assessed it. Unfortunately, because once he manipulated it, I have to now strengthen it. Because it had been stuck for several years, in that position, then there was degenerative changes because the joint compensated. And so I've had to do a lot of strengthening. And number one is watching your posture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that chronic forward head posture that people get from sitting in chairs, being on their computer. Runners are typically, they tend to forward head posture because we open our mouth then to breathe through the mouth versus breathing in through your nose. And when you have a forward head posture, that's what happens. You become a mouth breather. And so you can get more issues of asthma and allergies because you're not ventilating through the nose. So I've had to really change my whole dynamics. And which just helps now, as you know, I treat barefoot all day long, so I don't wear shoes. So that definitely has an impact on your spine and your posture.
Yeah. Good. So we mentioned it a little bit before, and I want to come back to the topic of the core and the abdominals, and which is also related to lower back. So core training and core strength is very sexy words and very fashionable because they sell magazines, but they also give you a guilty conscience when you get injured and, did you work your core? No, I didn't. So there's a lot of confusion. They're overused and sometimes neglected. So I want to shine a light on the core for a bit, since I have the expert here with me. So can you tell me in your own words, can you define what's the core? Because we can say, okay, for me, it's from the kneecaps to the shoulders, somewhere there in the middle. But in your own words, what is the core?
The core is multi-level, right? There's multi-layer, you should say. Core, the word core means center, you know, core of the apple. So core of the body is the center of where the upper body and the lower body are meeting together, and where is that strength? And that is somewhere in the lumbar spine and thorax, and the thorax is extremely important, not necessarily always thought of as being part of your core, but it's a connection of your arms to the lower back. So we look at the TL junction, the meeting point between the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine. The actual muscles themselves, if we talk about the deep layer of the core, we look at the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor is connecting from your coccyx and it's going into your pubic symphysis. And that is basically, making an analogy, the bottom of your box, right? When you breathe, your diaphragm, which is connecting at your TL junction, when you breathe in and take a big breath in, if you breathe properly. Well, now breathing is often done incorrectly, right? People either chest breathe or they abdominal breathe, but they don't actually lateral costal breathe.
Yeah.
So the core to me is that diaphragm. That diaphragm is a significant influence in the deeper core. And then on the bottom, you have your pelvic floor, and they're working together. If one is tight, the other is tight. If one is weak, a lot of times you have, problems with the other. Then around that, you have the deeper layer of the transverse abdominis, which is coming off the back, wrapping around the sides and around the front. And that's the deepest abdominal muscle. And then at a spinal level, on the back side, you have your multifidi, and they are the only part of, well, not only, but one of the few segmental muscles that we have on the spine. We have rotatories in the thoracic spine, which are big, but multifidi muscles go all the way up from the lumbar spine, across the sacrum, all the way up your neck.
That's the muscle you can feel opposite your belly button, next to your spine.
Deep, yes. So not the paraspinal muscles. So there are, if you find your spinous process, you find the spine in the back, and if you put your fingers into what we call the gutter,
Mm-hmm.
You're still touching the spine, but you're in the gutter. If you come out of the gutter, you're onto a paraspinal. But inside that gutter, you have those multifidi muscles. So yes, they're deep in there and they work together. So Paul Hodges out of Australia has done a lot of work that the minute you move your arm, your pelvic floor contracts. He's done a probe, a study of two, himself and another researcher, because they had to use a catheter going through the penis to evaluate the contraction. But it was interesting that before they even moved an arm or before they moved the leg, that pelvic floor contracted.
Mm-hmm.
And the significance of that connection of why do we do that? And that's because we have to stabilize the base so that you have a stable shoulder blade and arm to work off of.
You have to have an anchor point, so to say.
Exactly. And that core comes from that pelvic floor, that deep transverse, and that multifidi and the diaphragm being solid and strong. So that then the layers, so then you have your internal.
So this is what we can call the inner core, so to say.
The inner core, exactly. So the inner core, that deepest layer, are those muscles. And we have to work at, and that's what you see with a lot of these athletes. They've done a lot of work with the outer core. So
Mm-hmm.
their obliques are really strong, the quadratus lumborum is strong, their glutes are strong, but you find weakness and incoordination in those deeper core. If you have weakness in those ones that I've mentioned, now you start to have weaknesses and tightnesses in the psoas, so the hip flexor, and the hamstring. You see people have tight hamstrings or tight hip flexors. You have to ask yourself, a muscle doesn't get tight for no reason. It gets tight as a reaction to something, to protect something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually due to either weakness, incoordination, or loss of endurance of that inner core. And now your psoas and your hamstrings are having to take over. And when they do, they become tight and they become injured. And people try to stretch them all the time, and it doesn't work. And actually makes things worse because
there's already tension. Why do you want to bring more tension?
Yeah, and those muscles are being told by the nervous system, protect. You need to protect. And so if you work the inner core and then work the agonist, the opposites, and get the muscles balanced, then they can relax. And we actually have to come back and train those muscles to be stronger and more coordinated, the hip flexors, at the right time. Mm-hmm. So, and then your obliques, in pregnant women, a lot of times they're often told, don't work out, don't work your abdominals, and that's the worst thing that they could do, because the baby's changing and you have this thing growing inside. And then you end up with diastasis recti abdomini, where the abdominal muscles, the rectus, the six-pack muscle, splits. They get weaknesses in their pelvic floor. They start having diaphragm issues and rib issues because they haven't done things correctly while they've been pregnant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so when we think of stability, bringing stability in the inner core, okay, with patients and injuries, we want to have like a neutral spine or something close to it to actually start from the inside and work outside. But for people with a relatively good working body, stability is not the same as rigidity. So we want stability in all movements that we do. We don't want to be stable just in one position. And there's a lot of confusion going on as well, I think.
Absolutely. That's a good point, that there's a difference between stability and rigidity. We have to be able to move, and that's movement control. So can you activate these muscles, and then can you get those muscles to control first planar movements, so movements in simple directions, and then can you get those muscles to control three-dimensional movement training and dynamic. So these muscles the core is not a static They're not static muscles. These are dynamic endurance muscles. They're very different from your power muscles, from when weightlifting, right? So the difference between sprinting, like a sprinter, and an endurance runner, you know, you can take the best sprinter, take Usain Bolt, you know, and ask him to run a marathon. He probably wouldn't be very good at it. I don't know, but my guess is compare him and his job, you know, and his profession, and try to make him become, you know, to run a marathon, or like you run these ultra marathons. You know, it's very different training. And the same thing, you take an ultra marathon runner and you try to make him try to run against Usain Bolt. There's apples and oranges. And that's where we have to look in. These deeper segmental core are postural muscles that are working all the time, and they need to look and be able to work through movement. It's not about just doing 10 sets of 3 sets of 10 exercises. It's using it all day long and changing how we move and how we think about how we stand. And when we start to get people to understand that, we start to realize, okay, you know, they start to say to me, I never knew that therapy was so mental. And I said, yes. You know, unfortunately, I mean, you know, if you have an operation, even ACLs, you know, they have an operation. Okay, I can get your knee to bend, I can get your knee to straighten, I can get your quadriceps to get strong, I can get your hamstring to get strong. But then my next question is, why did you tear it in the first place?
And I often tell people, like, everything you do in your day is an abdominal, is a core muscle, core exercise, or an abdominal exercise. So think about the movements you do and try to figure out how your body reacts to them. Because there's what we talked about is the muscle coordination. So some people are too focused on that core and the abdominals to make them strong, but there's no coordination with the rest of the body. So it's like there's a software problem, so to say. Okay, there's some strength, but it's not applicable, or it's not usable, and the problem is it stays the same, remains the same.
Exactly. And they need to start to incorporate that into when they bend down to pick up their child, or they bend down to pick something up out of the garden. Well, sometimes it's heavy, sometimes it's light, but the core has to adjust. Okay, how much tension do you have to have in your pelvic floor when you pick up a 50-kilo, you know, sack of potatoes versus reaching down and picking up, you know, a shoe? There's different levels that, and the core has to be able to adjust to those demands and those requirements. And it might need more at the end of the day than it does first thing in the morning when you're more energetic. We see this with women after pregnancies and having problems with the pelvic floor and what we call prolapses, that in the earlier in the day, they're stronger in that pelvic floor, but at the end of the day, gravity has been working and things get a little bit more difficult to activate and keep strong.
Yeah, and I see when people are able to combine this muscle coordination with proprioception and perception, then suddenly there's a lot of power, because the movements become rhythmic, and suddenly you can generate a lot of power without even being strong. The strength we can add afterwards if we need to, but you see this combination with knowing your own body and firing at the right time. It's a lot of power that it brings.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then what I want to touch upon is as well, it's actually the mobility in the hips and in the upper back, because often the core is strong enough and there's some muscle coordination, but it's the upper back limitations and the hip limitations that holding people back. Again, sitting, everyday posture as well. But I found this equally important than just working on the core.
Absolutely, and this is why we were talking about the thorax, right? and the thorax, the upper back being so important to have rotational motion and decompression, right? So as we walk, we're always keeping our head straight and our eyes level. But everything underneath our head is rotating, and some are rotating one direction and others are rotating in the opposite direction. And if there is a stiffness, then that has to be compensated for. And if you're stiff in your hip because you're sitting at your desk and you've lost the extension and the rotation, well, and you're walking, that rotation has to be increased and made up for oftentimes in the lower back, and leads to degenerative changes in the lower back. And your thorax, you know, if you have a restriction and you're not able to rotate one way, something has to rotate in the opposite way so that you keep your eyes level and your head straight.
Yeah, and same with the hips, with the internal rotation that is often missing.
Exactly.
Translates higher up into the chain. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, so what would be your advice for people? I want to start some core training, just very low basis, assuming there's no injuries or anything. What now? People are at home. How can they integrate small movements into their working day? We talked about squatting, but how can they activate the inner core a little bit more throughout the day?
My biggest thing, the easiest trick, is to think about your arches of your feet, right? So if you stand, what are your feet doing? And oftentimes people have flat feet and they pronate, or they have flat feet and they have inserts. If you stand there and think about just elevating your arches, lifting your arches. So instead of being flat, that they actually start to lift. The minute you lift those arches, you're going to get facilitation of the deeper core, and you'll feel the pelvic floor kick in. You'll feel your lower abdominal kick in. You'll feel your external hip rotators kick in, and you become more upright. The minute you let those arches flatten, you'll feel the shoulders roll in, you'll feel the hips roll in, the knees roll in, and the feet flatten. So if you want to think about activating and keeping your inner core on, definitely as you're walking around barefooted, you think about lifting your arches and where is your position. And thinking, okay, is my ear over my shoulders, over my hips, over my ankles, or am I standing behind? So if I'm standing, do my hips go forward of my ankles, and to compensate, I then lean back, which is what happens when we have shoes, because most shoes have a heel to toe difference. So if you're not flat-footed and you're in a bit of a shoe, that's going to immediately bring your femur forward, and then what you're going to do is then lean backwards in your lumbar spine and your thorax to compensate. So you have to think about bringing that hip bone back right over the ankle so that you're perpendicular and to the ground. And if you then say, okay, then my shoulder is right over my hip bone, and then my ear is over my hip, so that you're not here. But I always say, think about a string stuck to the back of your head and it's pulling you up as though you're making yourself taller. I always wanted to be taller than I was. So whenever they measured you, you're always trying to be I call it a giraffe neck. So you're lifting up the back versus being a turtle. So no turtlenecks, but being more of that giraffe. So you're elongating and just getting a sense that that's how you should be all the time. That is probably the most influential thing you can do to use it during the day, is think about your posture and think about, what are my feet doing? Where is my back of my neck? Is my head forward? because that's going to create all kinds of problems in the diaphragm and the tightnesses. So can we get out, not by bringing the shoulder blades back, but bringing the chest up? Can we bring our chest up, do a slight chin tuck, and elevate our feet? Those 3 small changes is probably the best that you can do. Now, if you're sitting, because you're sitting in lockdown, and you have to sit, I'll say, try to sit with your knees down below your hips. So take a towel, wedge it, sit so that your knees are down, because that automatically is going to help you come off the tailbone, come off your posterior pelvic floor. It's going to help you keep more activated in what we call the anterior pelvic floor and keep you more engaged in that deeper transverse abdominis without having to work and do specific exercises, but just holding that position and not being rocked back on those tailbones.
Yeah, cool. So to come back to the arches of the feet,
yes,
just to make it clear, you want to lift the arches without curling the toes, because often people trying and nothing moves, and then the toes will curl. So
right. And you don't want to be rolled on the outside of your feet, right? We think of it as a tripod, so that your contact is on the outside of the by the heel, on the fifth toe, the 5th ray, we say, and then the other contact is on the 1st ray. So you have that tripod, 1st ray, 5th one, and then the outside of the heel. You don't want to be rolled in and putting pressure on the inside of the heel, which then leads to plantar fasciitis and medial heel bruising. So yes, you want to keep your big toe down. You don't want to curl your toes, but you want to lift the inside of the arch without rolling your feet out, if that makes sense.
To me, it does. Okay, great. Normally, we always wrap up with like a useful tip, but you've been very generous with your tips and things. So I will write it all out, so I think you gave a lot. So I want to thank you for this conversation, and hopefully to see you soon in real life.
Yes.
We live so close, but still. But it was nice to see you again. Nice talking to you.
Absolutely.
And I wish you good luck with all your projects and future challenges and things you take on.
Yeah. We can talk about the diaphragm after your breathing classes.
Yes. Yeah. There was a lot of touching points with the new course that I'm doing. So
but all it integrates. What's nice about all of this is that we can all collaborate together to
exactly, and I'm sure we can fill another episode, which maybe in the future might be a possibility. So thank you for the chat.
Thank you,
Enjoy
Ken.
the rest of the day and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thanks.